Hello and welcome to Hot Pursuit, part of Ahval video and podcast series. Today's title is A Mediterranean Duel, Erdoğan, Sisi, and the Fate of Egyptian-Turkish Relations. This is the title of a report, a big report, written by Nicholas Danforth. And Nicholas Danforth joins me for evaluating and for expanding on this report. Welcome, Nick.
Welcome. Thanks for having me on.
Great to have you. Nicholas Danforth, to give an idea about who he is to our viewers and listeners, he's a non-resident senior research fellow with the Hellenic Foundation for European and Foreign Policy. Hellenic Foundation for European and Foreign Policy is also known as, in short, ELIAMEP, which focuses on regional issues, Eastern Mediterranean, and Black Sea, and also Turkish-Greek relations in general. Well, Nick, your report is extremely enlightening and also timely because of the changes now that are due to take place because of the shift of power in Washington, D.C., where you are based, from Trump administration to Biden-Kamala Harris administration. And this is a burning issue, of course, because there are lots of changes that's taking place in the region. Yes. Turkey and Egypt perhaps on the lead, as lead players and actors. So I think there are various layers of this issue for a deeper history, but also current developments. Let's begin with the current developments in the past 7-8 years, because that's where it happened mainly. Two countries basically they became more hostile to each other. There are historic differences, but this is now hostility that's, I think, we can talk about. What are the root causes of this rift, currently speaking?
Well, what seems so interesting about Turkish-Egyptian relations now, and what I tried to capture in the report, is that this is at the intersection of a conflict that's at once very personal and ideological between the Turkish and Egyptian governments, between Erdoğan himself and General Sisi. But also what started as this personal bilateral conflict has now become enmeshed in a much broader regional conflict, maybe even a conflict that spans two regions, the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East, and that Turkey's national security interests, Turkey's broader foreign policy goals, as well as Egypt's for that part, are now have become incorporated into a much larger dynamic. That means even if Sisi and Erdoğan themselves decided to bury the hatchet, even if you had new governments come to power in Egypt or Turkey, it might be very difficult to walk back what started as a purely bilateral dispute.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that we are having this conversation because this is the 10th anniversary of what is called Arab Spring. I don't use that term, I use Arab Awakening rather, which was not happening as an awakening at the end. It's basically a blip in history, but it is naturally coincided deeply with this rift that took place. What led to this difference of ideas, and which developed in 2013 into a both personal and state hostility between these two powers?
Well, I think the Arab Spring and the way it played out in Turkish foreign policy really gets to the heart of how the trajectory of Turkish foreign policy under the AKP. It's interesting when you look back at Turkish foreign policy in the 2000s, you don't necessarily, there was a lot of concern that the AKP was following an Islamist foreign policy, is clearly trying to be more active in the Middle East. And yet what you saw was something very different from the policy that would emerge. You saw, Erdoğan famously going on vacation with Syria's Assad family. You saw, Turkey actually developing pretty good relations with the Gaddafi regime, making a lot of money off Turkish business and contracting in Gaddafi's Libya. You also, at the same time, it's interesting, something I found when I was going back through doing research for this paper, you had some comments in the 2000s from the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, from Mohammed Morsi himself, criticizing the AKP for being too secular, criticizing them for actually having pragmatic domestic and foreign policies rather than trying to promote a more strictly Islamist government at home and more strictly Islamist policy abroad.
We should also remember that Erdoğan, I think in Cairo, had this interesting statement emphasizing Turkey's secular, structure and also freedom. That I think echoed negatively within the Ikhwan, within the Muslim Brotherhood.
Right, even once the Egyptian revolution
that was
had
2011,
occurred,
wasn't it?
Yeah. And again, it's obviously hard to tell how much of this is for public consumption, how much of this is for Western consumption, what the audience is. No, but certainly going back before 2011, there was, both in Erdogan's approach to domestic policy and in his approach to foreign policy, something much more pragmatic, which was somewhat at odds with the kind of more ideological, purist vision of, say, the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. But I think during the Arab Spring, you suddenly had a sea change where, what might have been a latent ideological impulse in the AKP came to fruition. And suddenly they, after initially opposing NATO intervention to topple Gaddafi, Turkey got on board with it. After initially trying to talk to Assad and promote reforms in Syria to avoid the uprising, Turkey got on board, energetically backing the uprising. Amidst this transition, the revolution in Egypt and the fall of the Mubarak regime and the recognition that a Muslim Brotherhood dominated government in one form or another was likely coming, I think suddenly fired up a real desire, hope, potential for a much more purely ideological policy on the part of the AKP. And you see in some of the statements that Erdogan made when he went to Cairo in 2011, some of the statements that Davutoglu, who went with him, also made, that they really imagined everything was coming together and that they could have the regional influence they wanted, they could have the economic success they wanted by partnering with ideologically aligned, Muslim Brotherhood-oriented Islamist, but democratically elected governments around the region. So you see this very optimistic rhetoric in Egypt about Turkey, even before the Muslim Brotherhood is elected, about Turkey and Egypt forming an axis of democracy. You see really optimistic predictions about how Turkish trade is going to triple with Egypt. Then when the Muslim Brotherhood actually comes to power, Turkey offers them $2 billion in loans, I think. The Turkish and Egyptian governments, or the Turkish and Egyptian navies, actually carry out joint naval exercises called, I believe, Sea of Friendship. So there really is this optimism. And it's worth noting at the time, too, that an optimism, if not completely shared by Western governments, not inimical to the way Western governments saw it. Certainly in 2013, Turkey was much more democratic than the autocratic governments that were getting toppled across the Arab world. Statements that Erdogan made about his support for secularism pleased optimistic Western audiences. He then said some stuff about Israel on the same trip that got them a little worried. But, at the end of the day, if you looked at models for what Egypt could become, both in terms of its foreign policy and its democracy, 2013 Turkey looked a lot better than the alternatives.
Right. And then two things happened. Gezi protests happened in June 2013, and a month after, big change took place in Egypt. Taksim Square and Tahrir Square became sort of synchronized in a way, in the perception at least, by Erdogan, who became more and more suspicious about what's taking place in both Turkey and Egypt, because I think the construction of this leadership in the Islamic world type of thing, with the surfing upon the Arab Spring, was basically starting to get shattered in Erdogan's world. Is that a correct understanding of what you are writing in your report?
I was going to say you've summarized it better than I could. I think that's what I tried to get across to people, just the way, both the real parallels and then how much stronger the parallels must have seemed in Erdogan's mind between suddenly having popular uprisings in Egypt that served as a pretext for a military coup against the elected Morsi regime, at the same time that you had popular protests in Turkey, not obviously in the Turkish case a pretext for a military coup, but still, given Erdogan's history, given the some of the things that have been published by Nokta years earlier about how the military had envisioned using popular protests in order to undermine the AKP regime, given the fact that the Gezi protests, I think, marked the kind of belated turn on the part of the Western media against Erdogan, the really conclusive shift towards seeing him as an authoritarian rather than democratizing leader, this clearly played to very deep-seated fears in Erdogan's mind. And then, of course, the fact that when you actually had a military coup that toppled the Muslim Brotherhood, the United States refused to call it a coup. Saudi Arabia and the UAE stepped in to support Sisi's dictatorship. This, didn't really get much protest from the Western governments. This very much played into it's the understandable perception of Western hypocrisy on Erdogan's part, which, then when you look at the 2016 coup attempt in Turkey, very much, I think, contributed to his perception that this was all, both the Gezi protests and the 2016 coup attempt were part of a Western coordinated plot against him. And if any of those attempts had succeeded, he remained convinced that the West would have treated it the way they treated Sisi's coup in Egypt.
But also, in particular, between these two countries, Sisi, who came to power, took from day one a very clear and solid stance against Erdogan and his government. I think that also is a major, if not the major, contributor to this rift, right? Because I think Sisi saw how, and I want to hear your view about this, how deeply sort of, intelligence cooperation between Muslim Brotherhood flanks when Morsi was in power and Ankara was happening. And, he also had the backing, Sisi had the backing of the sort of anti-Muslim Brotherhood segments in the Egyptian society. And also parts of the Egyptian society, as I understand it from our coverage throughout the years, were disgruntled with the way, as they see it, as humiliating from the Turkish prime minister to Egyptian people, because Egyptians are proud people, as we know it, the most proud in the Arab world, perhaps. I think all of these factors may have played a role as well, right?
Well, and then subsequently, too, I'd add, in very concrete ways, Erdogan supported the Muslim Brotherhood. Sympathetic to this, as it helped people who were fleeing Sisi regime, gave them homes in Istanbul, allowed them to continue their political activities. I think this made it wasn't purely ideological. There was a practical side to this. Sisi saw Erdogan as supporting the ongoing opposition to his government, and that further consolidated the opposition between the rivalry between the two.
Escalation continued, and Erdogan did the sign, the Lamia sign, right, etc. But at that time, and I think in your conclusion, you come into this part, but what was the driving force for Erdogan and his government? What at that stage, because the Muslim Brotherhood had lost, and they were, mainly jailed, the entire leadership of the Ikhwan. And then this thing started to happen, this negativity between these two big powers. Egypt is the 9th largest army in the world. Turkey is the 2nd most powerful army within NATO, etc. But overall, what was the thing that was happening? What was the idea of confronting Egypt so strongly?
Well, and that's what I'm interested if other people have theories on this, but it did seem like that was a moment where Turkish policy became, it was principled, it was ideological, it was personal, but it wasn't, and other governments, even other leaders who might have been sympathetic to the Muslim Brotherhood, might have been, opposed to Sisi's undemocratic policies, might have still continued to criticize him. But Erdogan, again, took this much further, took this in a much more stubborn direction than a lot of other governments would have, and that certainly laid the groundwork for the Turkish-Egyptian dispute to become part of a much broader set of conflicts in the Mediterranean and the Middle East.
Right. We will come into this, but of course, that part of it was the diplomatic relations were diminished. It didn't. It wasn't normal anymore. But of course, what happened at that time was not very helpful for already sort of stained problematic relations between two countries throughout history. If you go back deeper into history, I think something there is needed to be revisited by the current leaderships in order to repair and normalize the relations between these two powers, two big people. But there is something in history that maybe our viewers and listeners should be invited to the attention of.
Well, it's interesting in this piece I tried to write a little bit about the history because people have tried to interpret it in a range of different ways to match contemporary political realities, and it's in part because the two countries have such a intertwined, tangled, and complicated history. It's surprisingly hard to do. One of the most striking examples to me, you had a show produced in the Arab world about the conflict between the Ottoman Empire and the Egyptian Mamluk Empire, which was cast in the show and by a lot of commentators as this, historic example of Turkish-Egyptian or of Turkish-Arab rivalry. And yet, as a few people commenting on the show pointed out, I mean, the Mamluks were, predominantly Turkish-speaking. They were a Turkish-speaking government that in many ways had more similarities in terms of their culture, their style of military organization, their history to the Ottomans than they did to the Arab society they ruled over. And these kind of historical ironies continue. If you look at the founder of modern Egypt, Mehmet Ali, was born in what's now Greece to a Circassian or Albanian family.
Mehmet Ali Pasha.
Mehmet Ali Pasha, exactly. Went to Egypt as an Ottoman Pasha, as the Ottoman governor of Egypt, fought to defend Egypt for the Ottomans against the French, fought for the Ottomans against the Wahhabis in Saudi Arabia, fought for the Ottomans against the uprising that became the Greek War of Independence, then tried to invade the Ottoman Empire, possibly in order to make himself sultan. And then when he couldn't take over the Ottoman Empire and become sultan himself, he kind of settled for becoming the founder of modern Egypt. So it's a strange history. I remember reading somewhere, I was surprised by this, the British governor who ruled Egypt for the British at the turn of the last century apparently spent his entire career, like 20 years in Cairo, only speaking Turkish, never bothered to learn Arabic, because that's what he needed at the time.
Right. Yes, intertwined histories indeed. The conqueror, in the eyes of the, from the perspective of Ottoman history or Turkish history, the conqueror of Egypt, the famous Selim II, his nickname was Yavuz, my name. And Yavuz in Arabic comes from Abus. Abus means grim, nasty, grim, cruel. So that's my name. Anyway, that's also part of this Selim II image, the big war that Egypt loses, Caliphate story. All of these are there as well. Yes, it's a very complicated history, common history indeed. But that brings us also to today. Given also Turkey's neighbor to the west, Egypt has also deep relations with Egypt. The Greece, has deep relations with Egypt. So we are where we are right now with the quite rapid developments in Eastern Mediterranean, which develops with Turkey cutting a naval agreement with Tripoli government, which leads to, as you point out in your report, a lot of, which triggers a domino effect between Greece and Egypt and other powers in the region. And it's where we are. And we go back to your title, A Duel in Mediterranean. Who will come out winning, given now that the Biden administration is in power? And there will be changes in approach in many aspects of the regional conflicts.
Well, so I mean, I think one of the problems for U.S.-Turkish relations, setting aside Turkish-Egyptian relations, is that whatever bilateral issues the United States and Turkey have, Turkey has now, in part because of this conflict with Egypt, put itself at odds with almost all of America's partners and allies in the Middle East. So yeah, as a part of this pro-Brotherhood, anti-Brotherhood conflict, Turkey's fallen further afoul of Saudi Arabia and the UAE. After the discovery of natural gas in the southeastern Mediterranean, you had Israel, Egypt, Cyprus, Greece, and now additional countries coordinating more closely to find ways to jointly exploit those natural gas resources and export them to Europe. And this was, originally Turkey, for example, had been in talks with Israel about developing a pipeline route that Israel could use to export its natural gas finds. As a result of bilateral disputes between Turkey and Israel, Israel opted to work with Egypt and Cyprus on this. At the point where Turkey had bad relations with Egypt, at the point where Turkey didn't recognize the Cypriot government, in a way, it makes sense that all these Egypt, Israel, Cyprus, and then, of course, Greece would try to find ways to work together and wouldn't invite Turkey to join them. And the result was that Turkey was isolated from what's now become the Eastern Mediterranean Gas Forum. It then resorted to a range of aggressive, provocative, use whatever word you want, responses, be they, gunboat diplomacy to keep the Cypriot government from exploiting its natural gas resources, escalating it wasn't the side that escalated, but responding to the escalation in Libya against Egyptian and UAE-backed forces there. And as a result, it's, whoever was in the right to begin with, however this conflict developed, the more Turkey has escalated, the more it's tried to throw its weight around in the Eastern Mediterranean, the more it's consolidated this hostile alliance between a range of other countries who are concerned about its presence there.
And solitude as a result.
Exactly. It's isolated. The other countries all happen to be countries that the United States is very close to. You saw Pompeo very much supporting the Cyprus and Israel and Egypt on this. You're likely to see a continuation of that policy under the Biden administration. I think Turkey has recognized the degree of its isolation. I think Turkey is making some initial steps to try to tone down this hostility, to try to improve some of these strained relations. I think precisely because this dynamic has taken on a life of its own, because these countries have increasingly become worried about Turkey, feel the need to coordinate in opposition to Turkey, it's going to be much harder for Turkey to lessen these tensions and, break apart or weaken what's now become a very hostile coalition facing it.
So where we are now is full of complications, because now there is a proposal by Erdoğan. As you say, first of all, there are steps, that's sort of small steps to Israel to revive the diplomatic relations. And also, as you mentioned in your report, some statements by Turkish officials about opening the doors with Cairo, and also the exploratory talks between Greece and Turkey, which were welcomed by the EU and United States. And then there's this proposal by Erdoğan about Mediterranean Conference, which sort of, for tactical reasons, probably Germany especially looks very positively to. But given this picture that you're depicting, it seems impossible, or it means very difficult, if not impossible, to organize such a conference with the participation of the countries that have postured themselves against the Erdoğan government now so clearly: Egypt, Cyprus, which is not recognized by Turkey, and Israel, and all have expectations. Israel expects cutting off ties with Hamas. Cairo is very conditional about cutting off ties with Muslim Brotherhood. And Greece says basically, stop, your seismic research vessels, floating about in the Eastern Mediterranean. So how will this situation resolve? Is it irreversible now, all this posturing that has taken place between Greece and Egypt and other countries?
I mean, right, that's the dilemma. I mean, I don't know that Turkey's clearly gone on a charm offensive. It says it wants to have good relations with everyone. It's proposing conferences. It started talks with Greece. But exactly as you say, I mean, I think all these countries are happy to talk. All these countries are happy to have, in Greece's case, the exploratory talks, have a meeting, have a conference, have our intelligence officials sit down with each other. But as you said, they have expectations. They have concrete demands of Turkey. They feel like if they can, continue to coordinate with each other and maintain a strong front, they expect Turkey to back down. And it doesn't seem so far, be it in bilateral relations with the United States, be it in bilateral relations with Israel or Egypt or Greece, that Turkey is prepared to make the concrete concessions that these countries are demanding as the price for restoring ties. So I think, best case scenario, if you could prevent any escalation, if you could, Greece and Turkey can have as many exploratory talks as they want. If they're having exploratory talks that aren't going anywhere, instead of bumping ships in the Eastern Mediterranean,
Into each
if
other,
Egypt and Turkey want to both sit in on peace talks in Libya instead of, escalating and threatening one another, this isn't going to solve the problems. I don't think anyone should hold their breath for this to solve the problems, but it's clearly preferable to escalation. And I think it maintains the possibility that, be it through domestic political changes, be it through other geopolitical developments, solutions can be found to all these conflicts further down the road.
There's an additional point, and that will be the last question. I don't think I saw it in your report, but Biden administration, as critical and cold as it is to the current Turkish administration, Erdoğan government, it is not uncritical to Sisi government, Cairo. So what should one expect in the near future in dealing with these issues that touch both countries?
Right. I mean,
especially U.S.-Egypt relations are sort of a dark part in that.
And right. So I think when you're talking about Turkish-Egyptian relations and how America fits into the picture, or when you're talking about Saudi Arabia, I mean, you have to give Erdoğan his due. This has always been a consistent point of hypocrisy in the U.S. government's approach. I mean, clearly, say what you want about Erdoğan's democratic credentials, Sisi's worse. Saudi Arabia is a monarchy. This was not something that bothered the Trump administration a great deal. Not that Erdoğan's authoritarianism bothered them either. You are hopefully, I certainly hope, going to see a more consistent and principled stance from the Biden administration. You are going to see, and I think we've seen some encouraging signs, a little more pressure on Saudi Arabia, a little more pressure on Egypt. At the end of the day, my suspicion is that it's not going to be enough. It's not going to be consistent enough to really change this equation. At the end of the day, Saudi Arabia and Egypt are still going to be America's partners. The more democratic countries they're now aligned with, Egypt and Greece, that's going to help solidify the positive opinion that Washington has of them. The dynamic may shift a little bit, but it's not fundamentally going to change.
So in conclusion, as you say in the report, as long as Mr. Erdoğan and Mr. Sisi sit in their chairs in power positions, this duel is bound to continue in one way or another, in different dosages perhaps.
And I was going to say, exactly, I hope they can cool tensions. I hope we can, mitigate the risk of escalation. But I don't think you're going to see any real rapprochement.
Nicholas Danforth, non-resident senior research fellow with Hellenic Foundation for European and Foreign Policy, ELIAMEP. Nick, thank you very much for this enlightening conversation.
Thanks so much for having me on.